Part 2. Shaping Knowledge Through Information Literacy. Note-taking may seem dull, but it is foundational for research. Note-taking exists so that we can control information. And there is a challenge emerging in doctoral education that we see as doctoral examiners. And I've been worried a great deal at times by the referencing of PhD students and in PhD theses. And that refers to poor referencing, inaccurate referencing, insufficient referencing, and dated references. For me, references and referencing errors are deal breakers, and we're going to talk about that a lot through this professional development program. And it is worrying when we see errors in a PhD thesis that should have been resolved at the first year of an undergraduate degree. I'm being staunch here because our research culture, academic integrity, research integrity is based on information literacy. And yes, we can talk about plagiarism and collusion, but instead I want to be much more positive and proactive and explore particularly early on here the foundational skills that examiners require from you, our foundational skills that we look for when we read your thesis. So information literacy is the capacity to locate information, but also identify the type, mode, or genre of information, how we evaluate and analyse that information, and apply that information in a new context to a new problem or a new topic. And we apply that information while maintaining the integrity of the original, intentional and informational context to ensure that high quality referencing in context is in place. Information literacy is a relatively recent concept. It was first used by Paul Zakowski in 1974, and he described it as a series of techniques and skills to use information tools to engage primary sources to solve problems. Since this first use of the term, information literacy has been aligned with democracy and social responsibility. There is an ethics to information use, particularly if we're interested in democracy. And if we are interested in democracy, then our citizens require access to high quality information and also access to the skills to interpret this information well and with clarity. In other words, we can't have social inclusion without information literacy. It is part of lifelong learning. It is part of active citizenship. But for PhD students, information literacy is part of academic integrity, because you must demonstrate that you can not only access information, but you can evaluate information and you can use it accurately and transparently. For examiners, we are verifying that you as a PhD student have mobilised a diversity of sources, including very, very current material as well as historically important material, but also that you can interpret these sources, that you're not endlessly quoting or indeed endlessly paraphrasing, depending on one's discipline. You are analysing and evaluating these sources with rigour, precision, innovation and creativity, and that you're using these sources with respect, that referencing is correct and enough information is provided so that we can check your sources and we can evaluate the quality and the calibre of your interpretation. So now that we have that definitional work in place and you have a sense of what we are after as examiners and how important information literacy is to the evaluation of your academic expertise, let me show you why it matters so much. Information is, of course, derived from the Latin informare, which means the imposition of a form. What this origin shows us is that information is about power. It's about pushing a view or perspective onto others. We live in an information age. Information is everywhere. But beyond the cliche, what does that mean? Who has the ability to manage and to shape this information. And I'm really interested in two parallel movements. Firstly, the extraordinary availability of information for the digitally literate at the same time as information literacy, which can be defined as finding the appropriate information for the appropriate context, has become even more difficult to attain through the decline in public funding for schools, universities, libraries, and informational infrastructure. So the problem here is not Google. The problem is a lack of knowledge and a lack of information literacy. You see, the strength and the weakness of Google is that everyone can find a little bit of information. We use our already existing knowledge and we can continually satisfy ourselves that we're sort of finding what we need. So we're hungry for information and Google provides it for us, just like we're hungry for food and a McDonald's drive-through provides it for us. We don't think about the other choices we could have made because we're sort of satisfied. But the goal of education is not to satisfy us, it's to challenge us, to confuse us, to irritate us, to unsettle us, to agitate the truths that we have accepted all our lives. The problem with Google and its search box is that we can only use the vocabulary and the search terms that we already know. So if you do not know who Etienne Balibar is, then you cannot add his name to a search in post-colonialism. So in other words, Google will always make the searcher comfortable and perhaps overconfident because we're always going to find what we already know in a language that we understand. Because we cannot put words into a search engine that we do not know. And that's the problem with Google. Because we lack information literacy, vocabulary and knowledge, Google restricts, reduces and limits. And we're not even aware that it does it. It appears to deliver a world of knowledge to our screens. But instead, it delivers a glut of poor quality information rather than selective and carefully constructed and filtered information. So inexperienced researchers use the easiest sources to find, not the best, not even better information, but simple and straightforward information. If you want to find stronger, more effective information, then that necessitates the movement between search engines, between media platforms, between perspectives. It requires that we all widen our vocabulary and that we recognise the innovative writers in our field. There has never been an easier time to find information. What is so disturbing is that a few key decisions from a researcher can make such a difference. So therefore, in our environment of information obesity, the solution is digital dieting through information literacy. So simply changing from Google to Google Scholar radically transforms the type of information the user finds. It lifts the quality by switching sources to that which is refereed, that which is reviewed by scholars. But this is trying to convince a friend about the convenience of eating an apple or eating yogurt rather than home-delivered pizza. Think about all the metaphors we use to describe our engagement with the web: scrolling, surfing, linking. Each of these describe incredibly superficial movements through material. The question is how we develop advanced interpretive skills. So think about your search patterns today. Do you use the directory of open access journals? Do you use Google Scholar, or do you just use Google? The nature of literacy is all of us stay in our intellectual environments where we feel happy and understood and satiated and literate and untroubled by foreign ideas. But the starting point of learning is to have the courage to read defiantly and courageously, jumping into ideas that will confuse us, unsettle us, and upset our values, upset our experience. Challenge, builds learning. Conformity and comfort enable ignorance. Information literacy requires that we make choices about our information landscape rather than allowing software to make those choices for you. So my goal as a teacher, my goal as a researcher, my goal as a supervisor is to slow down your engagement with the interpretation of information. I've assembled a checklist that I ask every source that every student at university uses in their PhD. And I ask every student to think about these 10 questions when they approach a source or a piece of information. What are those 10 questions? Here we go. 1. Who authored the information? 2. What expertise does the writer have to comment? 3. What evidence is used to make the argument? 4. What genre is the document? Journalism, academic paper, blog, polemic. 5. Is the site, document, report funded by an institution? 6. What argument is being made? 7. When was the text produced or published? 8. Why did this information emerge at this point in history? 9. Who's the audience for this information? And 10. What is not being discussed? And what are the political consequences of that absence? Think about how many of those questions you ask yourself before you believe the source that you're using in your PhD. If you ask very few of these questions, then you are not information literate. Another strategy for information literacy is to start reading your sources from the back. Look at the sources that the writer has used to make the point and evaluate the calibre of the argument on the basis of those sources. So if they've used poor source material, then don't believe them. But how often do you start your reading process at the back and look at those references? If a bloke came up to you with a funny hat on, dribbling, and with a needle hanging out of his arm, you probably wouldn't take too much notice of him. But how many of us deal with some random's ramblings online because we haven't bothered to check the sources that this person is using? Google is popular, not because it's right, not because it's appropriate, but because it's fast and because it's easy. But at a university, and particularly in a doctoral program, fast and easy is not good enough. If someone holds information literacy, then we learn from prior experiences to improve our information-seeking behaviour, and we check the credibility of sources. Only when we understand the history of information and its context can we locate, evaluate, and demonstrate our originality. And you see, that is the gift of information, because it enables us as researchers to build knowledge.